Huliaipole 100%.
Huliaipole, 100%. Russia has completely conquered the strategic city of Huliaipole in the Zaporizhzhia region. The capture of Huliaipole, the second most important city in Zaporizhzhia under Ukrainian control, represents a key step toward the larger goal, the conquest of the regional capital of Zaporizhzhia, with around 1 million inhabitants. The Russian armed forces now appear stronger than ever since the beginning of the open phase of the war in Ukraine in 2022, and at this pace, they could achieve all their military objectives without any need for negotiation. Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning.
Muy buenas noches, muy buenas tardes y muy buenos días. Desde Berlín, Alemania, comenzamos la transmisión número.
From Berlin, Germany, we begin live broadcast number 289 of Demolishing Myths. Thank you very much for joining us, and please remember to help us with a thumbs up against censorship, as well as with subscriptions and memberships through our PayPal account. And of course, follow us on our social media, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. What a broadcast we have today. Because really, in the last 24 hours, news has appeared like I haven't seen in the past 3 months. Sometimes we lack new developments, we have to present familiar topics, even recycle some subjects. Today, truly, there's enough news to make 3 different broadcasts.
Para realizar 3 transmisiones distintas. Esa la cantidad de novedades, de hechos.
That's the number of new developments, political, economic, and military, from the past 24 hours. And we're going to present them all here, starting now, naturally beginning with the main topic of this broadcast, the capture of Huliaipole. Let's go step by step, in order, reviewing the situation in the Zaporizhzhia region, and above all, in the southern part of Zaporizhzhia, precisely where Huliaipole had so far been the main defensive hub of Ukraine. The situation is basically as follows. Here, in southern Zaporizhzhia, remember the Zaporizhzhia Oblast, at least, this is the part not yet taken by the Russians.
Los rusos, oblast muy importante, no solo por
a very important oblast, not only because of its natural resources and population, but also because of the famous, extremely famous Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, located here. Not in Zaporizhzhia city, further north, but in this region on the Russian side, under constant attack, despite the presence of personnel from the International Atomic Energy Agency, which, for some reason, documents the attacks but does not determine their origin. Even though on the plant side are the Russians, and on the front line, firing, are the Ukrainians. Yet they cannot determine where the shots come from. Apparently, the Russians might be carrying out attacks against the very plant under Russian control. But beyond that, there is the Zaporizhzhia region, a very important area, because since last year it has been listed among the regions considered Russian according to the Russian constitution. And this region, according to Russia, according to the Russian executive branch, according to President Vladimir Putin, represents one of the objectives of the special military operation, one of Russia's goals in Zaporizhzhia. This war has here a main, fundamental objective, the city of Zaporizhzhia, very large, very important, very wealthy.
Muy grande, muy importante, muy rica la de Zaporizhzhia. Y en ese sentido, antes de...
And in that sense, before we present the situation in Huliaipole, I want to show another development in the same direction recorded in the last 24 hours. In fact, the attacks here have been going on for some time. But, as in any war of attrition, like water wearing down stone, drop by drop, it gradually causes erosion, overflow, precisely the overflow of the containment dam, until the dam finally collapses. And then, we suddenly witness many seemingly surprising advances. But in reality, they are not surprising at all. They are the result of the previous attrition work, of days and days of attacks. Well, after many battles, first for Kamiansk, then for Plavny, now for Pogirsk, practically taken in its entirety, Russian advances began in the last 24, perhaps 48 hours, throughout this entire area.
48 horas en toda esta zona, una vez más retrocedo para
Once again, I step back to place this here. This very important dam, through which the Dnipro River runs its course until it flows into the Black Sea. This is the most important river in Ukraine. This is a very significant dam, a very important body of water. In fact, from here, the cooling for the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant is generated. This body of water is extremely important. Here, in this area, directly towards Zaporizhzhia, and getting closer and closer, closer and closer. From here to there, it's 15 kilometers. Incredible. Practically 16 kilometers, 15.8. The Russian advances are getting closer, and now, the news of the day, the beginning of a Russian offensive, characterized by multiple attack points, multiple penetrations into Ukrainian territory.
Penetraciones en territorio ucraniano. Aquí lo presentan distintos mapeadores, inclusive, por ejemplo.
Here it is presented by different mappers, including, for example, Suryak, a neutral mapper. Here's one to the north, or actually one heading north, following the right bank of the dam, another to the north, a bit further east, and several others moving laterally. According to Suryak, this goes from here to there, another one runs through here, and there are several attack lines in this direction. The clear objective, on one hand, to capture this entire region, creating a platform for an attack on Ukraine's last, still somewhat fortified defense in Orikhiv, and once that is achieved, then a direct attack on Zaporizhzhia. Pay attention to the reports from several different mappers about this multiple attack along various lines.
En distintas líneas. Ahora sí, comencemos con Huliaipole.
Now then, let's begin with Huliaipole, a bit further to the right, but still as part of the same offensive in the southern region of Zaporizhzhia, still under Russian control, once again with the objective of Zaporizhzhia. Down here, the last city, still fortified since the early days of the war, without the direct, or at least without the open, intervention of the Russian armed forces in 2014, when clashes began between the pro-Russian separatists, who rejected the coup carried out in the context of the Maidan, across all of Ukraine, but especially in Kiev in the Maidan.
Toda Ucrania, pero por sobre todas las cosas precisamente en Kiev, en el Maidan. Maidan llaman a la plaza principal de Kiev, sede del
Maidan is what they call the main square in Kiev, the seat of government. This is where the clashes began between the pro-Russians, Ukrainian pro-Russians, and the central government. Since then, the city has appeared fortified and increasingly entrenched, but despite that, the Russians managed to capture it completely today. We are going to show the images. This is the last strong defensive position near Orikhiv, not as fortified, but still part of this strong defensive line, now practically overrun along the entire contact front. Attention! This was Ukraine's strong defensive line, now almost completely breached across the whole front.
De todo el frente de contacto. Aquí todavía un pedacito de la línea original, pero muy vulnerable.
Here, there's still a small stretch of the original line left, but it's heavily damaged, precisely because once the Russians managed to advance further east of Huliaipole, they were then able to launch an offensive, not only head-on, so to speak, from south to north, from bottom to top, but also from top to bottom. So they began, this time for real, an offensive from the rear. And this is the last and most fortified city here, while Orikhiv is also on this same line, a little further ahead. Images of the situation. Here, once again, is the second most important city in Zaporizhzhia, still under Ukrainian control.
Todavía bajo control ucraniano, y una vez más, una vez tomada esta.
And once again, once this city is taken, the next objective, both from the rear and from the front, is Orehov. Likewise, according to this offensive launched today by Russia toward the north and east, to the right, they will also attack Orehov from the opposite rear. And once Orehov is destroyed, or rather conquered, and the entire main defensive line is broken, they will head straight to Zaporizhzhia. That is the main strategic importance of Huliaipole. Images. Let's start with yesterday's images, which are quite interesting. Well, these are some of the images of Russian soldiers. Yesterday, the Russians captured half of the city, along with the flanks, the central area, half of the central zone.
Los flancos, la zona céntrica, de la zona céntrica la mitad. Estas las imágenes
These are the images distributed yesterday by the Russian troops themselves. Over here, there, taking down the Ukrainian flag. The city is quite destroyed, a relatively large city. Note the size of the city, one that before the war began had around 10,000 inhabitants and was very, very fortified. More footage from the Russians, this time without music. There in that building, there are still traces of the fighting, still smoke from the attacks. Up until yesterday, that was the situation. Something very important happened yesterday, and that's why I want to show this at the moment when the Russians capture the city center. Until then, remember once again, their strategy was to create a siege from the flanks. The Russians had conquered all the surrounding areas. It still seemed that the city center was in Ukrainian hands, and yesterday they managed to take it. As a result of that capture and the evident haste in the retreat, a rushed escape, the Russians succeeded in seizing the headquarters of, if I remember correctly, the 60th Motorized Brigade, responsible for the defense of Huliaipole. They also managed to take the command post, with many key elements for military analysis, hard drives. Now we're going to go through, with the Russian soldiers, the command center, basically with the flags, various printed materials, laptops or portable computers, files, radios, documents. There are a great many documents, cell phones, some of them even unlocked. There's a tablet. Attention, that unlocked phone with the information on it. This clearly shows a hasty retreat, yes. At the very last moment. They left radios, note the number of items, delayed their departure. Obviously, this was also a drone operations center, right? That explains the monitors and everything else. Maps, all kinds of equipment. Beyond the capture of Huliaipole, this is extremely significant for the military analysis of the tactics, operations and strategies of the Russian armed forces. A great deal of crucial information was left here. Usually, retreats or withdrawals, whether more or less planned, involve the destruction of even the seals of the various officers.
Hasta los sellos ahí de los distintos oficiales generan la destrucción de todo este material.
They are causing the destruction of all this material, which is now of great importance to Russian intelligence. Surely at this moment, Russian intelligence agents are having a field day with all these materials. There are obviously the drone operation monitors, countless computers, and so on. And this, by the way, because someone might react cynically, might respond cynically, oh no, actually the Russians are just staging this, it's all set up. No, according to Ukrainian channels themselves, including Deep State among others, they are presenting this as the headquarters of the Ukrainian forces in that region, in Huliaipole, once again under the command of the 60th Motorized Brigade. And they appear furious, absolutely furious, enraged for having left this in Russian hands, right? Very, very angry. Upset, of course, acknowledging it and grumbling, swearing, we could put it a bit crudely, cursing over this obvious oversight. Yesterday, for example, Deep State's own report from the Ukrainians themselves, well, they were really upset, very angry, furious about this situation. That was yesterday, and this is today. I'm talking about the total capture, or practically 95% of the city. We can determine this, as always, from the videos released by the Ukrainians themselves. Drone attacks against advancing Russian soldiers. This is the video they released, showing the Russian advance and the defensive attacks, with the Ukrainians retreating. We're not going to show these videos. Well, here are the Russians. Basically, we won't show them because of the direct combat scenes. But there is confirmation, and in fact here, from another source, the video of the final capture. Attention, this was also broadcast by Russian television today, with footage of the last attacks and finally the capture. Here, as the video clearly shows, the Russian armed forces took part in full. Those are Air Force bombs, of course. That's why the explosions are so big. FAPs everywhere. FAPs are what they call glide bombs, dumb bombs with an attachment, a guidance system, fins, and GPS, although some have slightly more complex systems than that. These allow the bomb to glide instead of falling straight down, making it possible to follow a trajectory of up to 100 kilometers from the moment of launch. Well, here, on the other hand, we have images of conventional and thermobaric missile artillery. That's why these images look like that. Those are thermobaric munitions. Remember, they create a fireball inside, which life disappears, right?
Desaparece la vida, ¿sí? Por las temperaturas extremadamente elevadas.
Because of the extremely high temperatures, all life disappears, from a person to a cockroach, right? Everything is wiped out inside that bubble of fire. But also before that, at the exact moment just before, there, as the Ukrainian soldiers are fleeing, right before the ignition, the lighting of that fireball, the physical effect of the explosion's diffusion, first causes the air to be consumed. Remember, you probably recall from school, combustion requires an oxidizer. You need both a fuel and an oxidizer. Well, the fuel is the material used in these munitions. The oxidizer is the air.
Los productos utilizados en estas municiones como comburente el aire. Por eso, antes de la ignición, con una chispa, lógicamente.
That's why, before ignition, with a spark, of course, before the moment of combustion, the oxidizer, the air, disappears not only at the site of the explosion, but within a radius of nearly 600 meters around it. As a result, the people located there also suffer extremely severe injuries due to the vacuum bomb, from the immediate extraction of air around them, and from internal wounds and organ tears, right? That's how demonic these thermobaric bombs are. Now we are witnessing the work of drones. That's why we describe this as joint work, combined operations, air, Air Force, Army.
Fuerza Aérea, Ejército. Bueno, acá participan todos los elementos de las Fuerzas Armadas.
Well, all the elements of the Russian armed forces are taking part here. Careful, careful, we don't want to show anything gruesome, as always. There are people here, you can see people, and destroyed vehicles, and so on. Conventional artillery, rocket artillery, thermobaric artillery, drones, drone against drone battles like this one here. Increasingly common. There's a destroyed Baba Yaga. And finally, yes, the infantry's work in advancing and clearing buildings, house by house, building by building. These are the images, and in the end, well, this last little bit we just saw, the raising of the flag.
El izado de la bandera. Bien.
All right. This is another video here, also with the flag captured, so Julia and Pole now fully. Very, very important. Good, a little more. And today we're not going to present only Russia's advances, because we also want to show many other things, in political terms, in economic terms, in terms of negotiations and relations with the United States, in terms of Putin's recent statements just minutes ago, tremendous ones. Well, here, yesterday, pay attention to the Russian advance in this region, already on the other side of the Huliaipole River. Huliaipole is the name of this little stream here.
Huliaipole es el nombre de este riacho por aquí. Recuerdo, hace no mucho presentábamos en una...
I remember that not long ago, during a talk with Fernando Moragon, we presented the capture of the first point of this P85 highway, which is essential for supplying Huliaipole and the entire southern region of Zaporizhia, still under Ukrainian control. Well, they've already taken it, the entire road from up here to this point. But now they've also crossed the river located right next to it, on the left bank of this road, and have established a bridgehead there. In a way, they made a very significant capture yesterday in this area. A place known as Kositsebe. What a name, Kositsebe. A small town, obviously, we're presenting it, but very important because it creates a platform for the next advance towards Zaporizhia. And here again, sorry, there are images. Once more, the attacks. First airstrikes, then artillery, then drones, and finally the infantry. A little faster this time, and being very careful not to show any images of anyone, neither dead nor wounded. That's never the intention. Well, The drones are clearing even inside the trenches. Vehicles destroyed one after another.
Vehículos destruidos, uno tras otro. Bueno, esto no lo queremos a la vista. No, 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 no.
We don't want this in sight. No, 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 no. Well, this is the horrible thing about war, isn't it? Right. Meanwhile, they're also pounding you with attacks and bombs. Yes, this is very important here. And now, the last part of our military analysis of this broadcast before moving on to the military analysis of the airstrike carried out early this morning. A tremendous airstrike, with more than 550 bombings last night, just against Kyiv. Terrible, yes, terrible. We're also going to present a military analysis of that, but not from the front line. I wanted to say that here in Mirnograd, incredibly, there are still pockets of resistance, and the fantasy, the completely senseless, futile attempts of the Ukrainians to create an escape route by attacking from the north. Yes, to evacuate the soldiers still trapped and resisting here.
Soldados todavía embolsados aquí resistiendo. ¿Cuál el sentido de la resistencia? ¿Por qué no capitulan?
What is the point of resistance? Why don't they surrender and save their lives? Well, because of orders from their superiors, obviously they can't. And that's why these soldiers, how to put it, counterattacks, counteroffensives, operations with an enormous human cost, completely senseless. Here's an example. We show it only as an illustration of the stupidity of this fantasy that Pokrovsk and Mirnograd would still somehow have a chance for a Ukrainian counteroffensive, that the Ukrainians could retake them. It's delusional. And yet, within this delusion and the total disregard for the lives of Ukrainian soldiers by the Ukrainian High Command, situations like this occur.
El alto mando ucraniano, situaciones como esta. Atención. Aquí uno de los...
Attention. Here we see one of these Ukrainian troops in one of those counterattack operations, trying to create a corridor, a passage, a safeguard for the encircled soldiers. Here, a small group advancing, 3, 4, 5 soldiers, moving from house to house, from building to building. Well, this is the final outcome. The Russians, of course, with 6,000 drones hovering 24 hours a day, detected the arrival of these soldiers, pinpointed their location. Bomb. All dead, obviously. Here are some running. Oh, shots fired at that one, clearly. Another shot. More gunfire. Well, there, obviously, almost hand-to-hand combat. Clearly, Russian soldiers were positioned very close by, but immediately afterward came the order to pay attention to this, the shockwave from that bomb.
Atención a esto, la onda expansiva de esa bomba. Bomba y bomba y esa gente.
Bomb after bomb, and those people obviously dead. What's the point of this? From a military standpoint, none. From a political standpoint, Zelensky's survival. The possibility that precisely tomorrow, at the meeting between Zelensky and Trump in Florida, at the Mar-a-Lago residence, Zelensky might, at some point in the conversation, present Mirnograd as still in Ukrainian hands, or some nonsense like that, thanks to the meaningless deaths of these people, just to delay for a few hours or days the city's final fate. Well, here we see an even larger group of Ukrainian soldiers, on the move, running, clearly desperate. Well, that's not a bomb, obviously that's a missile, judging by its trajectory.
Evidentemente eso, un misil por la trayectoria. ¿Y ahí cuántos? Uf.
And how many there? A good number of soldiers. Let's count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 soldiers. Considering current infantry tactics, this is an excessively large group. Too many soldiers together. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 8 or 9. But well, obviously fleeing toward a possible exit, detected, and with the expected result, right? How sad. So much meaningless death. So many lives lost without the slightest reason, not even from a military standpoint. Well, that's for the contact line. In the rest of the map, basically the same thing happens. A war of attrition, small, routine Russian advances, but nothing as striking as what we've seen so far. However, speaking of spectacular events, yesterday's early morning attack on Kyiv was tremendous. Truly tremendous. Here's the update. Tremendous. Here I want to, if I remember correctly, these are the routes. This is what I wanted, yes. 559 attacks, according to the Ukrainian armed forces themselves, took place early this morning, or rather, by the time zone, 559 attacks, of which 519 were with drones, 10 with Iskander-M ballistic missiles, 7 with Caliber ballistic missiles as well, 21 X-101 cruise missiles, and 2 X-22 cruise missiles, as clearly shown on the map of the attack trajectories. The targets this time appeared almost exclusively in Kiev, with the exception, naturally, of some along the contact line and a few in Odessa.
En la línea de contacto y algunos en Odessa. Recuerden lo que estamos presentando desde hace días, la preparación de...
Remember what we've been presenting for days, the preparation of Odessa for its possible capture, including the possibility of an amphibious or land offensive from Kherson, right? The preparation, the ongoing destruction of bridges, that's why there were some explosions down here. But yesterday, basically, the lion's share took place here in Kiev, with these 559 attacks. In total, most of them were aimed at critical infrastructure, and above all at power plants. Such as here, thermal power plant number 5, all from the Soviet era, obviously completely under fire. Many truly spectacular images of these attacks, this in the southern area.
Esto en la zona sur. Más imágenes aquí, una imagen interesantísima de la ciudad en la noche.
More images here, a very interesting image of the city at night, almost completely in darkness. Look at the buildings, all turned off, lit almost exclusively by the bombs, right? There we go. The bombs, or rather the drone strikes, the drones more than the bombs. Yes, and the fire, the trail of fire. Almost. Well, jokingly, some people, as a kind of trolling, some bloggers presented this as the nightclub of Kiev, right? Because it really looks like a nightclub due to the light effects, in this case from the explosions, of course. Okay, no sound. Well, this one has sound. This one with sound. Or very little sound, very low. At least here Now yes, there's a little bit.
Ahora sí. Hay un poquitito. Hay una explosión. Bueno, el sonido de los geranios pasando.
There's an explosion, or the sound of the gerans flying by. The whole city, of course, in darkness. Here, more, the city completely dark, under drone fire. Again, that image is spectacular. In the background, attacks in this area too on buildings. This was captured by a neighbor. This, earlier this morning. More attacks, the consequences of a strike on some target. Also a building. Another attack. Here, another building burning. Well, simply, attacks, more attacks. Even farther north, at the hydroelectric plant. They didn't just hit the 2 thermal power plants, number 5 and number 6, but also the hydroelectric plant here, attacked with missiles. Here, the result of the attacks, destruction in several places. Here, everything completely, well, not completely, but very damaged. Not everything totally destroyed, but still, it's even hard to get through there.
Todo completamente destruido, pero bueno, ahí inclusive es difícil el paso. Lógicamente ahí la represa de esta central hidroeléctrica.
Logically, there's the dam of this hydroelectric plant, and the damage, clearly visible. Well, we've already shown this. Some more images here of what happened, these from other sources. For example, I forgot to show something, I'll show it now, from Minograd later. Attention! Here, drones and more drones flying lower and lower, near Kiev. More, but now anti-aircraft fire, another drone. Here a rather curious situation with this drone. This is a new feature of the Geran drones, flying lower and lower to avoid radar detection. And in this case, the flight was so low that it collided with a high voltage or medium voltage cable. There, well, maybe it even broke a tower. There, perhaps unintentionally, by chance, causing the same problem as helicopters flying low, right?
El mismo problema que los helicópteros volando bajo, ¿no? La posibilidad del choque contra cables. Bien.
The possibility of hitting cables. Right. This is in Kiev, by the way. By the way, I also wanted to show something earlier, and I forgot, in Minograd, just a little while ago. Minograd, sorry, I should have shown it earlier. There's a video made by the Russians, trolling the Ukrainians. There are still pockets of resistance, but pay attention to someone appearing in the center of Minograd, already captured by the Russians. Pay attention, okay? There's a bearded man. There's the city hall, the municipal building of Minograd. A man with a white beard, Santa Claus with the Russian flag. This was yesterday. It's trolling. Santa Claus there with the Russian flag. This in Minograd. A Russian trolling of the Ukrainians in Minograd. This was yesterday. Lots of snow. Very cold. Very cold. Here are the civilians. An elderly woman with a cane, a couple obviously, greeting the Russian soldiers.
Bien. Comienza esto. Bien. Esta es la situación militar.
All right, how do we start this? Okay, this is the military situation. Now Zelensky's political situation, that of his clique, his henchmen, doesn't look much better. In fact, you'll remember that Zelensky, after drafting a 20-point plan based on the 28-point plan, this foolish back and forth of plans and counterplans, acted as if we were witnessing some kind of mathematical problem. The actors present formulas, one plan, another plan, with the idea of producing a resolution out of a whim. But no, this is where a war begins. A war that started because of an irreducible conflict. Right? So then, who is ultimately going to determine the resolution of the problem?
¿Quién va a determinar finalmente la resolución del problema? El ganador por la fuerza, imponiendo su voluntad.
The winner imposes their will by force when the other side surrenders. Then it's plan against plan, proposal against proposal, idea, whim, spark. All nonsense. Because the conflict is perfectly clear, the positions of both sides are perfectly clear, and either one side meets the other's conditions, or else. But the war drags on, right? War determines by force the real resolution of the conflict. Anyway, in Miami, the negotiation between, as Juan Antonio Aguilar calls it, Kushner and Vitkov's real estate employers, the envoys for the negotiation, the representatives of Trump and the Ukrainian representatives led by Umarov, after the resignation of Trump's right-hand man, the chief of staff.
La mano derecha, el jefe de gabinete de Zelensky debido a los escándalos de corrupción.
Zelensky, due to the corruption scandals. So, the Ukrainian delegation was basically led by Umarov. This time, well, they took Trump's original 28-point plan, reduced it to a 20-point plan, and now negotiations have begun between Zelensky and the head of the executive branch, President Donald Trump himself, in the United States, to determine whether to present this as something truly negotiable with Russia. Russia already has this plan in its possession. Or whether Zelensky will have to back down even further on his conditions.
Demandas o en sus condiciones. Por cierto, este plan de 20 puntos, si ya el plan original.
By the way, this 20-point plan, if the original plan was already seen as unacceptable to Russia, even though it presented many of Russia's conditions as already met or granted. Still, you'll remember that plan established, according to the version, that future Ukraine would have armed forces of 650,000 or 800,000 soldiers. Well, that's absurd, because according to the Russians, it should count 0 soldiers, or very few, maybe 25,000, something like that, no more. In this new plan, an even larger number of soldiers was proposed, and the withdrawal from Donetsk, but only if the Russians also withdrew. A bunch of nonsense, with no obligations for Russia, given the position of strength it holds. Anyway, ultimately, Zelensky announced a meeting with Trump to discuss this plan. In fact, right now, Zelensky is on his way to the United States. He's currently in the air. But his political situation, both internationally and domestically, is becoming increasingly problematic, more difficult. For example, let's start, first of all, with Trump himself, with whom Zelensky will hold this meeting tomorrow. Well, in an interview given yesterday and published today in the outlet Politico, translated, by the way, from English, here's the proof that this is all original, exclusive. Pay attention to the title. Trump on the meeting with Zelensky.
Trump sobre la reunión con Zelensky. Atención a esto, demoledores y demoledoras. Exclusivo. Trump.
Pay attention to these devastating headlines. Exclusive. Trump to Politico. Zelensky has nothing until I approve it. Trump's comments come ahead of his Sunday morning meeting with Zelensky, who will bring with him a new 20-point plan to end the war. President Trump presented himself on Friday as the ultimate arbiter of any peace deal between Ukraine and Russia. Ukrainian President Zelensky is expected to meet with Trump in Florida on Sunday morning and tell the press that he is bringing a new 20-point peace plan. The framework includes a demilitarized zone, and the meeting is expected to focus on US security guarantees. Well, that's the delusional idea behind this plan, that Ukraine would pull back from Donetsk, but Donetsk would become some kind of demilitarized zone, with no Russian troops, no Russian military control. Well, that's madness. Russia is never going to endorse such insanity. But anyway, the surprising part of this. However, in this interview, Trump appeared lukewarm towards Zelensky's latest proposal, and in no hurry to support the Ukrainian president's initiative. Zelensky has nothing until I approve it, Trump said, so we'll see what he's got.
Así que veremos qué tiene. Bueno, más claro que esto sobre la posición de...
Well, it couldn't be clearer than this regarding Trump's position on Zelensky for tomorrow. But be careful, because there's the international situation to consider. And Zelensky's domestic situation is also taking on increasingly tragicomic tones, because precisely today, before he boarded the plane, before he began his trip to the United States, a new operation by NABU, the Ukrainian anti-corruption agency, began. This agency, by the way, has already been responsible for the resignation of senior ministers under Zelensky, as well as his own right-hand man, Yermak. Yes, you'll remember, his chief of staff.
Si recordarán, su jefe de gabinete. Bueno, hoy comenzaron redadas en Ucrania.
Well, today raids began in Ukraine at the government headquarters against many ministers and several very close, extremely close members of parliament connected to Zelensky himself. Right? Over here, this black thing here is the microphone, nothing else. That's why the image looks like that. Sorry, let me move this, adjust a bit here. There we go. Okay, well today itself, attention, this situation was reported by the German press. We could show reports from the Ukrainian or Russian press, but we're going to show those from the German press, which is hardly suspected of being pro-Russian, in the newspaper Focus. Members of Zelensky's party suspected in a new corruption scandal in Ukraine, ahead of the meeting between Zelensky and Trump.
Antes de la reunión entre Zelensky y Trump, ¿sí? Justo antes de una importante reunión entre Trump y Zelensky, se destapó.
Right before an important meeting between Trump and Zelensky, a new corruption scandal broke out in Ukraine. Several members of the president's party allegedly received money in exchange for votes. And remember that behind NABU, the Anti-Corruption Bureau, stand the United States, the creators and managers of this office. Formally, the Bureau was established as part of the negotiations between the post-Maidan governments, basically Poroshenko's and Zelensky's, before the war. When an anti-corruption operation begins that affects Zelensky's inner circle, it clearly marks the start of a US attack on Ukraine as a form of pressure before the negotiations.
Estados Unidos contra Ucrania como forma de presión antes de las negociaciones. Esta vez, ante el avance de los...
This time, faced with the advance of agents from the Anti-Corruption Office, known as NABU, Ukrainian ministers and parliamentarians basically gave the order for security personnel, the National Guard, to block the agents' entry. That's why these figures appear, all heavily armed, one dressed in black with a submachine gun and others in military uniforms. At first, they refused entry to these officials, who had a valid court order, until they could no longer resist the political and media pressure and had to allow them in. Then they began collecting evidence, conducting searches, seizing documents, and carrying out various investigative measures.
El secuestro de documentos y distintas medidas probatorias. Esto, otra vez, organizado directamente.
This, once again, was organized directly from the United States, which clearly makes Zelensky's position going into tomorrow's negotiations extremely precarious, both because of Trump's statements and the pressure from the Anti-Corruption Office controlled from the US. It creates a very fragile situation for negotiating such a delusional plan. But on top of all that, As if that weren't already a terrible situation for Zelensky and for Ukraine, President Putin has just taken part in a meeting during a visit to one of the command posts of the Russian armed forces.
Las Fuerzas Armadas rusas. Aquí las imágenes.
Here are the images. Well, I included a report on the situation, and their officers in turn presented more specific reports. The most interesting part of what was done by Putin, Gerasimov, and other officers during a long broadcast of all this appeared at the moment when the situation in Kyiv was mentioned. Pay attention to what Putin said here.
Atención a lo dicho por Putin aquí. Es un poquito más bajo.
Pay attention to these exact words from Putin's report transcript. We see some intelligent people in the West suggesting that the authorities in Kyiv accept decent terms to end the conflict, providing a solid basis to ensure Ukraine's security from a long-term historical perspective, to restore relations with Russia and the Ukrainian economy. Meanwhile, here Gerasimov presents his part in this report. This is clearly a reference by Putin to the alleged US attempts to negotiate a peace plan, the famous plan with 28 points, now reduced to 20 by Zelensky.
Los 28 puntos ahora convertidos en 20 por Zelensky. Pero, atención ahora,
But pay attention now. Unfortunately, the leaders of the Kiev regime are in no hurry to resolve this conflict by peaceful means. Putin's exact words. He said this a year ago, speaking at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But today, judging by his reports and by the pace of events at the front, his interest in withdrawing Ukrainian military formations from the territories they currently occupy has practically dropped to zero for various reasons. Remember that about a year ago, in that famous speech at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Putin set the conditions for the start of negotiations, and among other things, made the withdrawal of Ukrainian forces one of those conditions.
El retroceso de las fuerzas ucranianas en el Donetsk, Lugansk.
In Donetsk and Luhansk, already completely taken, but the Donbass is still not entirely. If they retreat from there, then we can start negotiations. Well, here, Putin is presenting a change in that position, because according to Putin himself, once again, I said this a year ago, speaking at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but today, judging by your reports and by the pace of events at the front, the Russian advances, our interest in withdrawing Ukrainian military formations from the territories they currently occupy, has been reduced practically to zero for various reasons. They no longer want them to retreat.
Ya no quieren que retrocedan. ¿Para qué retroceder? Si Rusia esto lo conquista.
Why step back? If Russia's going to conquer this anyway, don't retreat, don't start a negotiation, or... We presented a proposal for them to pull back and begin negotiations, but since they rejected that proposal, and today Russian troops appear stronger than ever, then why should Ukrainian forces retreat now? If Russia's going to take everything anyway. Here it is, confirmed. As stated, Putin's warning, made several times and mentioned on this channel on numerous occasions. This idea of, we want peace, but only under the Russian conditions required for peace.
Cumpliendo las condiciones rusas requeridas para la paz. Si no, vamos a conquistar todo por la guerra.
If not, we're going to conquer everything through war. Once again, this is precisely Putin's confirmation. The Ukrainian leadership rejects peace, so we no longer want the agreement that they should retreat and that we should start negotiations. Enough. Enough talk. Enough negotiations. Enough proposals. They don't want peace. Fine then. We'll conquer it militarily, at the pace at which Russian troops are advancing through the territory, and at the pace at which the Russian Air Force is pounding Ukrainian strategic infrastructure with bombs across the entire country, especially in Kyiv, Lviv, Odessa, and so on.
Etcétera, etcétera, etcétera. Esta es la confirmación.
This is the confirmation. Here, a bit more from Putin, from what was said. The authorities in Kyiv do not wish to end the matter peacefully. We will resolve all the tasks before us by armed means during a special military operation. Here is Putin, once again speaking. His words accompany me as I present the transcript of his report. Once again, the authorities in Kyiv do not wish to end the matter peacefully. We will resolve all the tasks before us by armed means during the special military operation.
Armados durante la operación militar especial. Analicemos las tareas inmediatas aplicables a
Let's analyze the immediate tasks applicable to those groups whose commanders are currently attending our meeting. And there he calls on everyone to carry out the concrete work of reporting each specific situation. What was said here? Devastating words. Thank you very much, Javier, for the message. Keep your spirits up. Your reflections are nourishment for today and for the future. Thank you very much, dear Javier. As has been said here 1,000 times, Russia wanted negotiation, wanted peace, but Ukraine had to respond, and the sooner it responded, the better for Ukraine. Well, at this pace, the Russians finally decide that they will achieve their objectives militarily.
Van a conquistar sus objetivos militarmente. Y cuidado,
And be careful, because for now they are going to achieve the goals set a year ago, but in a situation of practically absolute military superiority in every aspect of the conflict. And not only superiority over Ukraine, but also over NATO, which sponsors Ukraine. Remember that the United States and NATO, as a whole, sponsor Ukraine. They couldn't defeat Russia. Russia ultimately prevailed over all of them. And for now, the Russians have decided that they will achieve all their objectives militarily, the same objectives set back then. If today Russia wants to change its goals and decides it wants many more, it can also achieve them. Militarily, they can conquer them. Today, the Russian armed forces appear stronger than ever since the beginning of the war. Since the open phase, since the beginning. The war began in 2014, remember that, but the open phase started in February 2022. When the war began, Russia deployed around 125,000 troops in its so-called special military operation. Apparently a lot, but along such an extensive front, it was actually very little. With this, it wanted to force negotiations, to create a negotiation process, and it did. The operation may have achieved that goal, responding to the objective of initiating negotiations, which first began in Belarus. Later in Turkey, an agreement already seemed finalized, already negotiated and practically signed, until Boris Johnson arrived with Biden's order, or rather from the people behind him, the neoconservative hawks behind Biden, so that Zelensky would reject the already concluded agreement. And it's not just us saying this here. One of the Ukrainian negotiators in those meetings, still a member of the Servant of the People Party, Zelensky's party, also presented it publicly. We had reached an agreement. We had held negotiations in Belarus. We had held negotiations in Turkey. We had reached an agreement. They only needed, in some way, to finalize it with their signatures. Zelensky and Putin were supposed to determine the final closure of the agreement, one similar to the Minsk agreements. But NATO's order determined that there would be no agreement. 1 million deaths later, today, the Russian armed forces no longer have 125,000 soldiers in the territory as they did then. But, according to Putin himself, they currently have 750,000 soldiers directly participating on the battlefield. Once again, from 125,000 to 750,000 on the battlefield. Let's also remember that those 750,000 soldiers on the battlefield are accompanied by around 1,600,000 active soldiers in the rear. So, 750,000 plus 600,000 makes roughly 2,500,000 active soldiers. Not reservists, active ones. 2,500,000 to 3,000 soldiers today. When they started, no, much fewer. And in addition, they have plenty of reservists. They can call up 9 million reservists. But well, the reservists were basically given military indoctrination, completed mandatory military service, can perform basic military tasks, but lack the capabilities of professional forces. These 2.5 to 3 million soldiers, 750,000 of them are on the front lines.
Soldados, 750.000 de ellos en el frente. Esta es la situación actual, nunca más fuerte que ahora.
This is the current situation, never stronger than now. Once again, 125,000 soldiers at the front at the beginning, 750,000 now. Accompanying those 125,000 were perhaps a number that, roughly speaking, reached a total of 1 million soldiers. Well, today there are 2.5 to 3 million soldiers in Russia. In terms of weaponry, the superiority is evident in every area. Drones, missiles, aviation, bombs, even infantry, tanks, and so on. I can't recall a single element in which Ukraine and NATO currently show military superiority. Not even in terms of troops. They're obviously grabbing people off the streets by the hair due to lack of personnel, sending them to die as cannon fodder.
Como carne de cañón para despacharla a la muerte. Eso obvio, pero tampoco en términos militares,
Exactly, obviously. But not in military terms either. In armament terms, that's the correct expression. I can't recall a single area of the war, a single dimension of the current conflict, in which Ukraine shows superiority over Russia, or rather in which NATO shows superiority over Russia. None. Nothing. Nothing gives even a little bit of hope for a possible Ukrainian comeback. Nothing. Zero. And on the other hand, if you want to look at it in economic or military terms, because remember, as Juan Antonio always insists, war is the management of resources. Exactly that. In economic military terms, by the way, Russia hasn't pulled its troops back again either, nor has it carried out a general mobilization, not at all.
Tampoco generó una movilización general, de ningún modo. Generó la movilización de 300.000 reservistas solo preparadas.
It led to the mobilization of 300,000 reservists, only trained as volunteers, and nothing more than that. None of them were sent to the front at the time, more than a year ago, almost 2. Nothing more than that. In Ukraine, once again, they're grabbing people by the hair, mostly men, right? But in economic terms, pay attention to this. The defense budget, Russia's budget for the war, the military war budget, now represents around 6% of Russia's GDP. Of the Russian economy, of Russia's output, the defense budget represents 6%. That in a country at war with all of NATO. A war of Russia against all of NATO, 6% of the budget.
Una guerra de Rusia contra toda la OTAN, 6% del presupuesto. El presupuesto estadounidense de guerra, sin participar.
The US war budget, without directly taking part in this, because it's involved only on the sidelines, without soldiers, without troops, at least not massively, without the large-scale use of its arsenal, without sending weapons, though less and less, of course, but in no way through direct intervention. In fact, most US troops now appear in the Caribbean. Trump sent them to the Caribbean, to Puerto Rico, Guam, the Virgin Islands, and so on, waiting for some kind of scheme. Without directly participating in this war, the US military budget roughly amounts to, or accounts for, about 4% of the US GDP.
El 4% del producto estadounidense. De la economía, ya no la más grande del mundo.
Speaking of the economy, no longer the largest in the world, now the second largest, but still a logically larger economy, quite a bit larger than Russia's. Naturally, a bigger country with more people and so on, also a richer country without a doubt. The United States, the center of European and global capitalism. 4% of a country, the United States, not at war. Russia, against all of NATO, 6%. It's not making a disproportionate military effort considering the situation. Let's go a bit further back in time, World War II. The first and the second, more or less the same. World War II, a riddle. The US war budget in World War II, the US defense budget in World War II, when it was directly involved, about 500,000 soldiers sent, more or less.
Directamente 500.000 soldados enviados, más o menos. Perdón, 500.000 bajas, más soldados enviados, no solamente 500.000.
Sorry, 500,000 casualties, more soldiers sent, not just 500,000. What was the war budget back then? Around 40%. Did you hear that? Devastating. World War II, the US defense budget during a conflict in which it was directly involved, though not as directly as Russia, which lost 27 million people, facing 80% of the Nazi troops and their collaborators. Hungarians, Romanians, Lithuanians, Croatians, Finns, all of them. some Poles too, though not mostly. Well, all of them on the Eastern Front. Yes, confrontation, conflict, an existential war for Russia. Well, this one is existential too, but that one much more so. Moscow was almost captured, and the Nazis wanted the Russians wiped off the face of the earth. Literally, yes, extermination.
Estados Unidos en esa guerra presentaba un presupuesto de guerra del 40%.
In that war, the United States had a war budget of 40%, and the Soviet Union about the same. Maybe a little more, maybe a little less. 40%, the war budget of a country at war. Now, once again, Russia is leading this war against NATO with 6% of its total defense budget. Someone might respond, well, but 6% is a lot. Yes, it is a lot for a country at peace, for a country not at war. But for a country at war and at war with all of NATO, no, it is not making a disproportionate effort considering the scale of the war, the adversary, and the issues at stake, which are existential for Russia. So then why all this calculation? Why all this reflection? Because precisely that, the fact that it is not making a disproportionate effort, determines the possibility of sustaining that effort. With this level of spending, with these troops, with this rate of recruitment, Russia can take part in this conflict against Ukraine or against the next proxy element, the next representative of NATO, Europe, or the United States. If it can take part in this, it can persist in it almost indefinitely. And that's the big difference. And that's why Russia now seems stronger than ever. With military, political, and economic development, its population largely supports this. Protests are practically non-existent, and ordinary Russians are barely affected, so to speak, by this war. Nothing like in Ukraine, where everyone knows someone who's been mobilized, someone who's died, someone who's been maimed, missing a leg, an arm, this or that. Not in Russia. In Russia, life goes on, more or less as usual, with, of course, the war in Ukraine, 6%. So now Putin decides, well, don't back down, don't go along with our peace offers. No, now we're conquering everything militarily, after years of negotiation attempts. And go sing to Gardel. Yes, a saying from my homeland. Go sing to Gardel. Go cry at the church. That's it, guys. Enough, friends. Enough negotiation attempts. Well, those are Putin's words based on a position of strength earned through the military efforts of the Russian armed forces and Russian society as a whole. The military-industrial complex, the economy, the people as a whole. With some effort, yes, but again, 40% of the war budget of the United States and the Soviet Union during World War II, 6% for Russia, 4% for the United States in peacetime in quotes, right? Always in a state of permanent war, but permanent wars against Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, right? They obviously don't start one against Venezuela, among other things, out of fear, among other things. All right, demolishers, both men and women. Announcements. Tomorrow, Sunday. Oh, it's already Saturday, how fast the week went by. Of course, the holidays. Well, first of all, best wishes to everyone for the holidays. It's been said several times. Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and so on. Tomorrow we'll be here with Fernando Perez Moragon, Sunday the 28th. The program will possibly restart tomorrow, DMP will resume with Santiago Martinez, and next year there will be changes and more changes on the channel, with individual programs by Fernando Moragon and Juan Antonio Aguilar, here on our channel, no longer on DMP Geopolitica, our sister channel, but here on Demoliendo Mitos, on this channel. And as always, on Wednesdays, a talk with Fernando, on Fridays, a talk with Antonio, And on Sundays, a talk again with Fernando. And some announcements, which we'll make tomorrow, about many very, very interesting new developments, considering, well, several issues, additional content elements, and some matters related to the increasingly overwhelming situation of censorship faced by analysts here in Europe, in ever-worsening conditions. People being censored, people with their bank accounts blocked, people sanctioned by the European Union, with their accounts frozen, and so on.
Bancarias congeladas y demás, por eso vamos a responder con algunas medidas también.
That's why we're going to respond with some measures in that regard as well, and to be able to present things that we can't show here. We can't show everything here, because if we did, then I too would appear on the European Union's sanctions list, with my bank accounts, my monthly income, like any of you, like any worker, sanctioned without even having access to my savings to buy food. That's the case for several analysts right now. For example, Jacques Vaux, a German journalist here in Germany, another Swiss citizen as well. Well, a situation of censorship that's getting worse and more concerning.
Una situación de censura cada vez peor, cada vez más preocupante. La Unión Europea en una deriva autoritaria cada vez.
The European Union is drifting toward an increasingly dangerous form of authoritarianism. That's why many of the changes are designed precisely to create, in some way, a way out through the side door, right? Through other platforms as well. Demoldors and demolidoras, thank you so much for being with us. Remember once again, please give a like, subscribe for free, and hit the notification bell if you want alerts for our broadcasts and content. Support us through memberships. We reactivated them recently. That helps us a lot, and also through PayPal. And follow us on our social media, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok, and also on our English channel, which keeps growing. Demolidors and demolidoras, we love you very much. A kiss, and see you tomorrow. Bye.
Los queremos mucho. Un beso y hasta mañana.